Okay, so today we were talking about asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction and what the benefits and the disadvantages are to one or the other. So I had forgotten to record during class time, so I'm just going to give you a quick overview so you get a chance if you were absent or if you want to use it as review. So we started the class with naming an organism that's unicellular, one that's multicellular, and then answering the questions for each. So some examples that students gave: unicellular would be something like E. coli. It would reproduce using binary fission because it's a bacteria, and that would be reproducing asexually. Some others chose unicellular organisms like an amoeba or paramecium that are not bacteria. So instead of using binary fission for them to reproduce, they would be using mitosis, and that would also be a form of asexual reproduction. Some multicellular examples were brook trout was one that one of the students used, and any multicellular organism that you chose would have to use both meiosis and mitosis, because all multicellular organisms have the capability of producing egg cells and sperm cells, right? Remember the meiosis, the E and the S in the spelling stand for egg and sperm. That's our little trick. So every multicellular organism has that capability. Once the egg and sperm have been created, the next step is they have to join for fertilization to take place for that one cell, and then grow using mitosis, getting all their other parts created. That would be sexual reproduction. A few people chose organisms that can do both asexual and sexual reproduction, such as a sponge or a sea star or planarian, and either way, they would still have to choose meiosis and mitosis because they still have the capability of producing egg cells and sperm cells and then growing through mitosis, or they would just reproduce asexually through mitosis only. So for example, a sea star regenerating, so a piece of it breaking off and then through mitosis only creating all the rest of the cells to create another organism. So after we did that, we talked about how all the organisms we've been learning about throughout this unit are all living, and as a living thing, they have all 7 characteristics in common: being able to grow, reproduce, respond to stimuli, complex and organized, acquire and use energy, right? All that stuff they have in common. But now we're starting to see differences among them, and we're starting to make comparisons. So today's focus was all about reproduction comparisons. Is it a benefit to be going through asexual reproduction, or is it a benefit going through sexual reproduction? Maybe it's a benefit being able to do both. Are there disadvantages to these? So we saw 2 short video clips that I'll show you in a second, and after watching the video clips, we filled out a question guideline, which will be in the bin, in the absentee bin, so make sure you get it if you were absent. If you were here, the paper that's titled Benefits and Disadvantages of Both Unicellular and Multicellular Organisms that we filled out today. You can keep that as a reference after watching these video clips, because these will help show you what the advantage or disadvantage might be. Take special note in this first video that you watch when the chromosomes are lining up during meiosis. They do something extra special, a little bit different than what we're used to seeing in cell division, where the chromosomes do something called crossing over. So watch when the X's come together, you'll see red X's and blue X's, and then each one takes a little piece of the other, and because of that, that allows for a lot of genetic variety in sexually reproducing organisms, which you'll see on the paper can be considered an advantage. Okay.
If multicellular organisms only use mitosis to reproduce, all of their offspring would be exactly the same, because their genetic information would be identical. Consequently, there would be no variety in the species. Multicelled organisms, such as plants and animals, reproduce sexually. 2 sex cells, one from the male and one from the female, are fused to make one new cell with half of the genetic material coming from the father and half from the mother. This is called fertilization. With meiosis, a special type of cell division occurs in the reproductive organs of both the male and the female. As in mitosis, the chromosomes replicate themselves, thus doubling the genetic material. Each chromosome now resembles an X shape, formed by two sister chromatids. But then something different happens. Each chromosome lines up with its corresponding partner and they exchange genetic material. This is known as crossing over. Now the chromosomes collect in the middle of the cell, and one chromosome from each pair is pulled to opposite ends of the cell. The cell divides in two, both containing half the number of the still attached chromatids.
I'm just going to pause it for a second so you can see what I was talking about with the crossing over, where you have a little bit of the red on the blue, a little bit of the blue on the red, so they have exchanged DNA at this point. So that's the crossing over that's taking place. So the end result, when this division is over, there are actually going to be 4 different cells, right? They're not going to be identical as we've learned in the other cell cycles. So this allows for variety within a species.
Each of these cells now divides, splitting the chromatids in half. By the end, we have 4 gamete cells, each containing half of the necessary DNA. If these cells were produced by a female organism, the gametes will be the ova or egg. If by a male, the sperm. When fertilization occurs, the egg fuses with the sperm and the 1/2 of the DNA from the mother merges with the 1/2 from the father, making a complete set of chromosomes. Once union has occurred, this single cell then divides through the process of mitosis and grows into an adult. Human beings, for example, begin as one cell and grow to become adults of approximately 100 trillion cells. The incredible number of gene combinations that results from this type of union ensures the genetic diversity of the species and the uniqueness of every individual.
Okay, so now in this next video, you're going to see them compare sexually reproducing, going through meiosis, to asexual reproduction. So really look for what would be an advantage or a disadvantage to either side.
Each of us is a unique individual. From the color of our hair and eyes to the shape of our lips. How is it that no two of us is exactly alike? That's because each of us is a combination of traits passed down to us from our parents. How does that happen? To find out, we have to go back billions of years to the first life forms to appear on Earth.
Those look like bacteria.
They are. And the first life forms were similar to modern-day bacteria. Tiny microscopic organisms, each consisting of a single cell.
Aren't all living things made up of cells?
Right. And bacteria are the smallest, simplest cells. Yet as simple as they are able to perform one remarkable feat. Can you guess what that is?
Multiply.
That's right. They are able to make exact copies of themselves, one after another, after another.
How do they know how to do that?
To find out, let's split this model of a bacterium in two. The inside of a bacterium is filled with a jelly-like fluid. Located within this fluid is a thin ribbon-like loop called a chromosome, shown here in red. The chromosome carries information controlling all the cell's activities, including reproduction. There are hundreds of separate bits of information on the chromosome. They are referred to as genes.
So when a bacterium reproduces, it is actually following hundreds of separate instructions, or genes.
That's right.
They all look identical.
They are. That's because they have only one parent. The same is true for other single-celled life forms, like these microscopic pond organisms. They have only one parent. The same genes are passed down generation after generation. That's why all of these organisms are identical. But look at these kittens.
Aww, they're cute.
They're from the same litter, yet they're all different. They have different colors and different markings. That's because they have two parents and share the genes of both. Single-celled organisms need only one parent to reproduce. But most multicellular organisms, that is, organisms with many cells, need two parents in order to reproduce. Multicellular organisms include just about every plant and animal you're familiar with, including insects.
Okay. So that wraps up the videos that we did. If you look at the sheet that we worked on in class, you'll see the comparisons that we made, that we wondered how many organisms are involved in reproducing with mitosis, binary fission. Talked about how it's only one organism, and in meiosis and mitosis, we have two organisms that are involved. What happens with the chromosomes during meiosis? There's an exchange in DNA with the other chromosomes. So that's that crossing over, where we saw a little piece of the blue mixed with the red. Is this possible in unicellular organisms? No, it wouldn't be, because they have no partner to exchange the DNA with, and because of that, every single one of them is identical, just like you saw in that little bacteria video. Is sharing DNA with another organism an advantage or a disadvantage to an organism? So we discussed in class how we could look at it from both ends. It would be an advantage, one, because there's variety within the species, and they can have a helpful trait being passed on. And we used a couple examples in class, like the short neck and long neck giraffe story I told you, right? Having the short neck giraffes and then a mutation happening, or some DNA genetic diversity where there's a longer neck giraffe, and when there was no grass that was available due to, a problem with whether it was a fungal infection or something wiping out the grass, well, now these taller neck giraffes were able to still eat and be satisfied because they had the leaves of the trees. So the species of giraffes still lived on with these long necks while the other little guys died out. So it allows the species to continue, where if they were all identical, that could mean bad news for an organism, where they would all die out in the species if they were all exactly the same and they didn't have a favorable characteristic. We talked about also that there's a disadvantage that they need to join with a partner, and that might be tough to find, right? The egg cell and sperm cell have to meet, and I drew a little picture on the side of your notes you'll see with the sponge, and we talked about how the sponge releases egg and sperm cells into the ocean, and the ocean is a very big area, and so for a sperm cell and egg cell to match up, that could be a tough thing. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be an advantage there. Then we said, is reproducing asexual an advantage or disadvantage to an organism? We said, well, again, we can look at it both sides. The advantage is that it's very quick, right? We talked about how bacteria can reproduce every 20 minutes. Right? Little energy is needed. They don't need to go find a partner. It's all by themselves, and boom, done, over. But the disadvantage then is no variety, right? That might mean that they could pass down things that are not so helpful. So I used a quick example of, let's say, bacteria. There's a bacteria species that does well in 65-degree temperatures or lower, and then we have a 70-degree day. So there's a whole bunch of these bacteria that have been reproduced. That 70-degree day comes around, well, now we've just wiped out an entire species. So being identical and having unfavorable characteristics could be a bad thing. We did mention, though, how bacteria do have the ability to mutate, right? Like all DNA can have mutations where there's a mix-up in the DNA where then they could be different from one another, and that's why there are so many different bacteria out there that are resistant to antibiotics and all sorts of other things, but that's a story for another day. But the basic idea here is that, typically speaking, asexual reproduction, it's going to be identical clones. Where the sexual reproduction, you're going to have that variety from that crossing over taking place. So we said, what's the advantage of being an organism that can reproduce sexually and asexually? It's the best of both worlds. So if the partner's not available, they can use that quick, efficient asexual reproduction. And that was most of the lessons. So we got to do that in groups, but you guys are just seeing it here and going through the questions. Alrighty.